There is a building on an island off the coast of Los Angeles that almost every visitor photographs before they have even stepped onto the dock. It stands right on the water at the edge of the harbour, round, white, 12 stories tall, with a red tile roof and tall arched windows, half Art Deco and half something Mediterranean, glowing in the sun as the boat comes in. It is the first thing you see arriving at Avalon, the little town on Santa Catalina Island, and it is the last thing you see leaving. It is on the postcards and the coffee mugs and the refrigerator magnets. It is the symbol of the whole island. It is called the casino, and in the nearly 100 years it has stood there, no one has ever gambled in it, not once. There has never been a single card table, a single roulette wheel, a single slot machine inside it. It has a movie theatre and the largest circular ballroom in the world, and it has never held a game of chance in its life. The name is not a mistake, and it is not a joke. The people who built it knew exactly what a casino was. They called it a casino anyway, using the older sense of the word, an Italian word that simply means a place where people gather to be entertained. They built a thing that looks like it should take your money, and they filled it with things they gave away, which turns out to be the single most important fact about the entire island, because the man who built that building spent his whole life discovering over and over that the thing you give away is worth more than the thing you sell. His name was William Wrigley, and to understand how one man came to own an entire California island, an island 22 miles long, and to run it for 30 years as if it were a single product on a shelf, you have to understand a stick of chewing gum, and more specifically, you have to understand the free gift that came with it. Because Catalina is not really a story about an island, it is a story about a premium. Let me tell you what a premium is, because it is the key to everything that follows. William Wrigley was born in Philadelphia in 1861, and he went to work young at 13 as a travelling salesman for his father's company, which made soap. He was, by every account, a natural. He could sell. And in 1891, at the age of 30, he moved to Chicago to set up on his own, distributing his father's scouring soap. Now, scouring soap is not an exciting product. It is a commodity. Everyone needs it, everyone already buys it, and there is very little to distinguish one brand from another. So Wrigley did what clever salesmen did in that era. To make his soap stand out, he attached a free gift to it. Buy a box of Wrigley's soap, and you got something extra thrown in for nothing. The free gift he chose was baking powder, and this is where his whole life turns, right at the start on a single observation that most people would have missed. Wrigley noticed that his customers were not especially excited about the soap, but they were very excited about the free baking powder. The gift was outperforming the product. A lesser businessman would have noted this and moved on. Wrigley acted on it. He dropped the soap and started selling the baking powder instead, as his main product. And then he did the same thing again. To sell his baking powder, he attached a free gift to it, and this time the free gift was chewing gum. He would give away a couple of sticks of gum with every can of baking powder, and once again he watched what actually happened instead of what was supposed to happen. And once again, the customers cared more about the free gift than the product. They wanted the gum. So in 1892 and 1893, William Wrigley did the thing that made him one of the richest men in America. He dropped the baking powder, the product, and started selling the gum, the premium. He introduced two flavors that are still on shelves today, Juicy Fruit and Wrigley's Spearmint, and he built them, through relentless, brilliant, pioneering advertising, into the best-selling chewing gum in the United States and eventually the world. Sit with the shape of that career, because it is going to repeat on a scale you would not believe. 3 times Wrigley started with a product and attached a free gift to help sell it. 3 times he discovered the free gift was worth more than the product. And 3 times he had the nerve to throw away the product and sell the gift instead. Soap gave way to baking powder gave way to gum. Each time, the thing he was giving away for free turned out to be the real business, and the thing he thought was the business turned out to be beside the point. It is worth slowing down on how good he actually was at this, because the island only makes sense once you see the scale of the mind behind it. Wrigley did not invent chewing gum, and he was not first to it. When he started, there were more than a dozen gum companies in the United States, and gum was a marginal, unglamorous product. What Wrigley did was understand, earlier and more completely than his competitors, that in a world of nearly identical products, the thing you are actually selling is not the product. It is the impression of the product in a customer's mind, and that impression is manufactured by advertising, not by the factory. So he advertised like no one before him. When the public did not take to spearmint at first, he did not give up on it. He pushed it relentlessly, poured money into it, plastered it across the country. He understood repetition. Tell them quick, and tell them often, he said, and he meant it as a law of nature. He put gum displays right next to the cash register, because he had noticed that people buy gum on impulse, in the last few seconds before they pay, so the location of the box mattered more than almost anything about the gum inside it. He gave away premiums to the shopkeepers too, not just the customers. Cash registers, coffee makers, scales, lamps, fishing tackle, whole catalogues of free goods, to any store owner who would stock and display his gum. He famously, at one point, mailed sticks of gum to every single name in entire telephone directories, millions of people, unsolicited, just to get the taste in their mouths. This is a man who thought about attention, the way an engineer thinks about water pressure. Where does it flow? What blocks it? How do you direct it? And when a man who thinks like that buys an island, he does not see rocks and trees. He sees the largest attention-getting device money can buy. He built an empire on that instinct. He built the Wrigley Building on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, that white terracotta tower that still lights up the river. He advertised in more than 30 languages. He took the company international early and aggressively, opening operations in Canada, in Australia, in England, planting the Wrigley name on counters around the world. By the time he bought Catalina, he was not merely a successful manufacturer. He was one of the most recognized commercial names on Earth, a man whose product was in millions of pockets on multiple continents, and whose real genius was that he understood the pocket was not the point. The mind was the point. He was selling a place in people's minds, and the gum was just the receipt. His slogan was "Tell them quick and tell them often," and in the Depression year of 1907, when everyone else was pulling back, he spent nearly $300,000 on advertising, an enormous gamble, and the next year his spearmint sales hit $1 million. And then, a wealthy man, a baseball man who had just bought into a team called the Chicago Cubs, William Wrigley did the thing that seems, on the surface, to have nothing to do with any of this. In 1919, he bought an island. He bought it at first almost carelessly, the way a very rich man buys a thing on a recommendation. In February of 1919, Wrigley and two partners, a real estate man named David Blankenhorn and a businessman named Robert Hunter, purchased a controlling interest in the company that owned nearly all of Santa Catalina Island, off the coast of Los Angeles. The sellers were the Banning family, who had owned it for decades and had never quite figured out how to make it pay. The island had, in fact, worn out a long line of owners before Wrigley, and their collective failure is part of why his success looks so striking. After the native Pimunians were removed, Catalina passed through the hands of a series of private owners like a hot coal. In 1846, days before the United States seized California from Mexico, the Mexican governor granted the whole island to a private citizen. From there, it changed hands repeatedly through the second half of the 19th century, as one owner after another tried to figure out what an island was good for. Smugglers used it. Otter hunters stripped the surrounding waters of sea otters for the fur trade until the animals were nearly gone. Miners chased silver across it. Ranchers ran sheep and cattle on it. Smugglers used its coves, in the years when California's trade was tightly controlled, to run goods past the authorities, because an island with 100 hidden inlets and easy sail from the mainland is what a smuggler wants. Each of these was an attempt to extract something from the island, to make it pay, to treat it as a product. Fur, silver, wool, contraband. And one by one they failed or faded, because the island's real value was never in what you could take out of it. It was in the thing itself, the place, the experience of being there, and you cannot ship that to a market. You can only invite people to come and stand in it, which is a thing worth money only if you already have another way to profit from their attention, which no one did until a man arrived who sold his real product somewhere else entirely, in every corner store in America wrapped in green paper. None of them cracked it. The first person to see the island's real future was a man named George Chateau, who in the late 1880s laid out the town of Avalon and began, for the first time, to imagine Catalina as a destination, a place people would pay simply to visit and enjoy. He gave Avalon its name, reportedly drawn from the poetry of Tennyson, from the island paradise where King Arthur is carried to rest. After Chateau came the Banning brothers, sons of a Los Angeles transportation magnate who built the idea up considerably. They created access to the beaches, they built the Pleasure Pier in Avalon in 1909, which still stands, and they worked to turn the island into a resort. And then, in 1915, a fire tore through Avalon and burned down about half of its buildings. The Bannings, already stretched, tried to recover, building a new hotel to draw visitors back, but the fire had broken them financially, and in 1919 they sold. So when Wrigley bought Catalina, he was not buying a blank paradise. He was buying a half-burned resort that had bankrupted or defeated nearly everyone who had touched it for 70 years. Everyone before him had asked the island to be a product, to pay its own way as a mine or a ranch or a resort, and the island had refused every time. Wrigley was the first owner who did not need it to pay. He had the gum. The island could be a gift because the profit was somewhere else. That is the difference that made all the difference. Wrigley bought his stake site unseen. He had not been to the island. He had, in the accounts that survive, essentially bought a picture and a story, and then he went to see what he had bought. He boarded a ship called the Hermosa with his wife Ada, and crossed the channel from the mainland, and as the fog lifted and the island came into view, he got his first look at it, and he said a thing that people who knew him repeated for years afterward. "My goodness," he said, "it is a mountain. I thought it was flat." He had bought a mountain in the sea, sight unseen, and the moment he saw it, something happened that had not been part of the plan. He fell in love with it. By every account, Catalina got hold of William Wrigley in a way that no business ever had. He and Ada spent a night in a suite at the St. Catherine Hotel, with the Pacific outside the windows, and woke up more certain than ever. Ada matters here, more than most accounts of the ruthless gum baron bothered to say. Wrigley's wife was his partner in the island in a real sense, and her fingerprints are on some of its most enduring features. The great botanical garden that would eventually surround his memorial, the collection of desert and island plants gathered from around the world, grew out of her idea. Where William saw an island as a device for attention, Ada seems to have seen it as a place to make beautiful and lasting things grow, and the softer, greener, more permanent side of what the Wrigleys did on Catalina owes a good deal to her. The showman married someone with a longer time horizon, and the island is better for it. And Wrigley, who had spent his whole life being the shrewdest man in every room, made a decision that was not shrewd at all. He decided he did not want to share it. So he bought out his two partners. He kept buying shares in the Santa Catalina Island Company until he owned a controlling interest outright, and effectively controlled the entire island himself. One man, one family, 22 miles of California, from end to end held as private property. The price is one of those facts the sources cannot quite agree on, which happens more than you would think with things this large. Some accounts put it at around $2 million. Others, including newspaper reports at the time, put it at slightly over $3 million. Either way, it was a fortune, and either way it bought him something almost no private individual in America has ever owned, which is a whole populated island, with a town on it, and a harbour, and thousands of acres of wild interior, all of it his. Now, a man who had just spent his life learning one lesson over and over might have looked at an island and asked the obvious question: what is the product here? How does an island make money? You could mine it. And Wrigley did for a while. In the 1920s he opened mines on Catalina that produced lead, and zinc, and silver, and some copper, and he ran them until the price of silver dropped and he closed them. There had been an earlier silver rush on the island back in the 1860s, cut short when the army occupied Catalina during the Civil War, and forced most of the miners off, so the idea of the island as a mine was not new. That episode is a small, sharp reminder that the island's beauty had always sat on top of the ordinary hungers of American history. In 1863 and 1864, prospectors swarmed Catalina after silver was found, throwing up a rough camp and staking claims across the hills. The federal government, in the middle of the Civil War, worried about Confederate sympathizers and about the general lawlessness of the place, sent the army to occupy the island, and the soldiers cleared out nearly everyone, allowing only a few miners with substantial claims to remain. The silver never amounted to much. Wrigley reopened that book briefly in the 1920s, running mines that pulled out lead and zinc and silver and some copper, until the price of silver fell and the numbers stopped working and he closed them. It was never going to be the point. A man does not buy a paradise to dig holes in it, and Wrigley knew the difference between a product and a premium better than anyone alive. You could ranch it. People had raised sheep and cattle on Catalina since the 1840s, and that continued for a while under Wrigley too. But that was not the point either, because Wrigley did not look at Catalina and see a product. He looked at Catalina and saw the greatest premium of his life. Let me say what I mean, and it is the whole idea of this video, so let me say it plainly. Wrigley's real product always was Wrigley. The name, the brand, the gum on every counter in America, and the idea attached to it. The idea of clean, wholesome, cheerful, modern American pleasure, available to everyone for a nickel. That was the thing he was actually selling, and the gum was just its physical form. And an island, a beautiful island, a mountain in the sea an hour from Los Angeles, developed into a paradise and thrown open to ordinary people, was the most spectacular free gift that idea could possibly have. It was a premium the size of a mountain. He was not going to get rich off Catalina. He knew that. He said, more or less openly, that he wanted to make the island available to the public, a playground for all. He poured money into it for the rest of his life, and never expected the island itself to pay him back, because the island was not the product. The numbers on that spending are worth pausing on, because they are the clearest evidence of what he understood himself to be doing. He paid a fortune for the island, and then he spent fortune after fortune on top of it, on ships and hotels and dams and a pottery and a bird park and a $2 million ballroom, decade after decade, with no expectation that the island's own revenues would ever come close to covering it. Any accountant looking only at the island's books would have called it a catastrophe, a bottomless pit swallowing money. But that accountant would have been reading the wrong ledger. The island was never supposed to balance on its own books. It balanced on the gum's books thousands of miles away, where the value of a beloved, wholesome, endlessly promoted Wrigley name showed up as sales in every corner store in the country. The island was a marketing expense, the largest and most beautiful one in American history, and by that measure it may have been the best investment he ever made. He was not losing money on Catalina. He was spending it deliberately in the one place it would do his real business the most good, which was in the public's affection. The island was what he gave away to sell everything else, including the version of himself that he wanted the country to buy. So watch what he does with it, because every single thing he builds on Catalina is a premium. Every one of them is a free gift designed to draw people to the island, and through the island to the name. The first problem was getting people there at all. An island is only a paradise if you can reach it. So Wrigley bought steamships, first the SS Avalon and later the great white SS Catalina, boats that could carry huge numbers of ordinary people across the channel from the mainland for the price of an outing. The SS Catalina in particular became beloved in its own right, a great white steamer that carried something like 25 million passengers across the channel over the decades of her working life, more people than almost any other American vessel of her kind. Generations of Southern Californians took their first sea voyage on her, and for many of them the crossing was inseparable from the island itself, part of the same day-long enchantment. She ran for the better part of half a century. Her eventual fate decades later, decaying and half sunk in a Mexican harbour, is a sad footnote. But in her prime she was one of the great pleasure ships of the American coast, and she existed entirely to deliver people to a premium. He was not really in the shipping business. The ships were a premium. They existed to deliver people to the gift. Then they needed somewhere to stay. So he built the Hotel Atwater in 1920, and over the following years thousands of small bungalows and the Grand St. Catherine, so that a family of modest means could actually afford a night or two on a private island. Then they needed water, because an island in Southern California does not have much of it, and the Franciscan missionaries had actually abandoned the idea of a mission on Catalina centuries earlier for exactly that reason. So Wrigley built a dam and a reservoir, Thompson Dam, at the middle of the island in 1924. He laid utilities. He ran a telephone cable under the channel. He built schools for the people who lived there year-round, and hung a set of tuned chimes that rang out over the town, a set of tuned bells whose sound became part of the daily rhythm of Avalon, marking the hours over the red roofs in the harbour. And that phrase, the people who lived there year-round, points at something easy to forget in all the talk of visitors and premiums. Catalina was not only a resort, it was a home to a small permanent community of people who ran the hotels and crewed the boats and taught the schools and fired the pottery kilns and lived, all year, on a mountain in the sea that belonged in its entirety to a family in Chicago. Their landlord was the Wrigley Company. Their water came from the Wrigley Dam. Their jobs, in many cases, existed because Wrigley had invented reasons for them to exist, like the winter work at the pottery. They lived inside another man's premium and made their lives there, and their descendants live there still, in a town where the deepest facts of daily life, the price of a home, the permit for a car, the use of the land, are still shaped by the unusual way the whole island is owned and held. He built other things too, stranger things, all in the same spirit. He built a bird park, an enormous aviary, which opened in 1929 and eventually held something like 8,000 birds from around the world in a vast glass and wire enclosure, one of the largest of its kind anywhere. It was characteristically both a genuine wonder for visitors and a piece of showmanship. It even became a resource for Hollywood, which was never far from Catalina. When the sound crew for the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz needed birdsong, they came out to Wrigley's aviary and recorded thousands of feet of it, so that the birds you hear in the Emerald City sequences of one of the most famous films ever made are in part Catalina's captive birds, singing on an island off Los Angeles. None of these things were businesses, they were infrastructure for a gift, and then there was the matter of the mud. In 1926, William Wrigley and an associate named D.M. Renton were driving across the island when their car got stuck in the mud. Now, a stuck car is an annoyance to almost anyone on Earth. To a man whose entire fortune was built on noticing that the thing under his nose was more valuable than the thing he was looking for, a stuck car was an opportunity, because Renton, dealing with the mud, noticed that it was unusually fine clay, high quality, the kind of clay you could make things out of. So Wrigley built a factory, Catalina Clay Products, usually just called Catalina Pottery, opened in 1927 and ran until 1937, making tiles and bricks, and before long a whole line of brilliantly coloured dishes and vases and decorative pottery, all from clay dug on the island. Those pieces are now valuable collectibles, hunted by people who have no idea what island they came from. But look at why he built it, because it is pure Wrigley. The pottery had two purposes, and neither of them was really to make money selling dishes. The first was to make the tile for the island's buildings, most spectacularly for the great building he was about to construct on the harbour, and the second, which he stated openly, was to give the island's residents year-round work, because a resort island empties out in the winter, and its people need to eat in January as much as in July. So the clay that a stuck car happened to reveal became the material of the island's own architecture, and a source of steady wages for its people, and a stream of beautiful objects carrying Catalina's name onto mantelpieces across America. One accident, worked in 3 directions at once, by a man who could not look at anything without seeing what else it could be, and now the building, the casino. By the late 1920s, Catalina was working. Wrigley's premium was doing exactly what a good premium does. In the 10 years from 1919 to 1929, the number of visitors to the island went from around 90,000 a year to 750,000. Nearly 1 million people a year were crossing the channel to the mountain in the sea. And when the ordinary attractions were not enough, Wrigley reached for the spectacular. In 1927, to generate publicity for the island, he staged the Wrigley Ocean Marathon, a swimming race across the channel from the mainland to Catalina, a distance of some 22 miles of cold, open, current-swept Pacific. He offered a staggering prize, $25,000 to the first man to complete the swim, and $15,000 to the first woman, sums that in 1927 could buy a house several times over. More than 100 swimmers entered. The conditions were brutal, the water cold, the currents unforgiving. Of the entire field, exactly 1 person finished. A 17-year-old Canadian named George Young swam the whole 22 miles and staggered ashore after 15 hours and 44 minutes in the water, the only finisher out of more than 100, and collected the prize. 2 women who came closest to finishing were each given a consolation prize, and the whole spectacle put Catalina on the front pages across the continent, which was of course the entire point. That is the machine again. A swimming race is not a business. It was a premium, a piece of pure spectacle, manufactured to convert a mountain in the sea into a headline. Wrigley did not care who won. He cared that 100,000 people read the word Catalina over their morning coffee, They also needed somewhere to gather at night. There was an older, smaller entertainment hall on the point, called the Sugarloaf Casino. Wrigley tore it down, and in its place, beginning in early 1928, he built the thing that would become the island's face to the world. He hired 2 architects, Sumner Spaulding and Walter Weber, and told them to build something extraordinary, and they did. The Catalina Casino, finished and opened on the 29th of May 1929, was the first completely circular building of its kind, rising to the equivalent of 12 stories on the edge of the water, surrounded by the sea on 3 sides, in a style that mixed Art Deco with Mediterranean revival, and topped it with red Catalina tile from Wrigley's own pottery. Inside, it had 3 levels, and understanding what is on those 3 levels tells you what Wrigley was doing. On the lower level, a museum dedicated to the art and history of the island. On the top level, a ballroom, 20,000 square feet of it, the largest circular ballroom in the world, where the big bands of the era played and thousands of couples danced with the Pacific on every side. And in the middle, on the ground floor, a movie theatre, the Avalon Theatre, seating over 1,100 people, and it was one of the first theatres in the entire world purpose-built for sound film for the talkies, which were brand new in 1929. Its murals were painted by John Gabriel Beckman, who had worked on Grauman's Chinese Theatre in Hollywood. It cost about $2 million, which is to say it cost roughly what the entire island had cost a decade before. To understand why anyone would spend a second fortune on a dance hall, you have to picture what a night on Catalina actually was in that era, because it was one of the genuine wonders of American leisure. A family, or a courting couple, or a group of friends would leave the Los Angeles harbor in the morning on one of Wrigley's great white steamships. The crossing itself was an event, an orchestra sometimes playing on deck, flying fish alongside the hull, the mainland receding and the mountain in the sea rising ahead. They would land at Avalon, a jewel-box town of red roofs curled around a perfect bay, and spend the day swimming in water so clear you could see the bottom, or riding a glass-bottomed boat out over the kelp forest to watch the fish, or hiking, or simply sitting on the beach in a place that felt 1,000 miles from the city an hour behind them. And then, at night, the casino. The lights of that great round building reflecting on the black water, the sound of a big band drifting out over the harbour, the largest circular dance floor in the world filled with couples, the newest film from Hollywood playing in the theatre below. For a working family from Los Angeles, it was access to a kind of glamour that in any other setting was reserved entirely for the rich. You could dance in the same ballroom, watch the same films, breathe the same sea air as anyone in America for the price of a boat ticket. That was the gift, and it landed for millions of people over the decades as something close to magic, which is exactly why the island's hold on the Southern California imagination has never really faded. Generations of families have a Catalina in their memory, a perfect day on a perfect island, and most of them never knew or cared that the whole enchantment was, at bottom, an advertisement. And it was called a casino, and it never took a bet because it was never meant to take anything. It was meant to give. A museum you could wander for free, a theatre showing the newest films, a ballroom open to the dancing public. It was a premium in the shape of a palace, the free gift at the centre of the free gift, and it works so completely that a century later it is still the single image that means Catalina to the world. That is the machine at full power. A gum magnate applying the logic of a nickel stick of gum to an entire island, giving away steamships and hotels and pottery and a 12-story ballroom in order to sell a feeling attached to a name. But there was one more premium, and it is the one people remember most fondly, and it is the one that shows most clearly that Wrigley did not really separate his businesses at all in his own mind, because he took the other great love of his life, and he moved it to the island too. He brought the Chicago Cubs. Before we follow the Cubs across the channel, one more building deserves a mention, because it ties the baseball and the island together in stone. In 1921, Wrigley built himself a home on the island, high on a ridge on the southeastern side looking down over Avalon Harbour. It was a grand house in a commanding position, the owner's house on the owner's island, with the whole gift spread out below it. And near it that same period he built the clubhouse and locker facilities for his ball team, the structure that would become known as the Catalina Country Club. So the Cubs did not just visit the island, they were given a permanent architectural home on it, a building of their own, tying the team physically into the fabric of the place. When you understand that Wrigley put his own house, and his team's clubhouse on the same island, within sight of each other, you understand that he did not really experience these as separate ventures at all. The gum, the team, and the island were, in his mind, one thing, himself projected onto the world. Wrigley had bought into the Chicago Cubs in 1916, and by around 1921 he was the principal owner. He loved that team the way he loved the island, without much regard for whether either one paid him back, and in 1921 he did the thing that fused his two passions into a single publicity engine. He moved the Cubs' spring training to Catalina. Every spring for the next 30 years, with a pause during the Second World War, the Chicago Cubs came west to the island to get in shape for the season. They trained on a field Wrigley built for them, and they used a clubhouse he built for them that still exists today as the Catalina Country Club. When they arrived, they rode from the dock on an open-air bus that the locals affectionately called the Catalina Goat, because it looked like a truck for hauling livestock, and the fans lined the bay to wave at them. Think about what that did. Every February and March for 3 decades, every sports writer covering the Cubs, and there were many, filed his stories from Catalina Island. The dateline on the baseball news, read by millions across the country in the depths of winter, said Avalon Santa Catalina. The island got months of free national advertising every single year, wrapped inside the sports pages, paid for by the fact that a very rich man happened to own both the team and the paradise, and saw no reason to keep them apart. 19 future Hall of Fame players trained on that island. Grover Cleveland Alexander, Dizzy Dean, and covering them one spring, calling the games for a radio station back in the Midwest, was a young announcer named Ronald Reagan. Decades before anyone imagined him as President of the United States, he was there because the Cubs were there, and the Cubs were there because Wrigley had turned his baseball team into a premium for his island, and his island into a premium for his name. Everything connected to everything. The gum sold the name sold the island sold the ships and the hotels and the pottery and the casino. The Cubs sold the island back to the mainland every spring. It was a perfect closed circle of promotion, and at the centre of it was a man who had figured out before almost anyone that in the modern world attention itself is the product, and everything else is just the gift you attach to get it. There was another audience for the island that Wrigley cultivated, and it left a deeper mark on American culture than almost anything else about the place. Hollywood. Catalina, an hour from Los Angeles, offered filmmakers something priceless. It could be anywhere. Its coves and cliffs and interior hills could stand in for the South Seas, for the Mediterranean, for a tropical island, for the open West, for almost any exotic locale a script demanded, without the cost and danger of an actual expedition. So the studios came, constantly, and they kept coming. Over the decades, more than 500 films, television shows, documentaries and commercials have been shot on or around Catalina. The most celebrated is Mutiny on the Bounty, the 1935 version that won the Academy Award for Best Picture, much of it filmed in Catalina's waters standing in for the South Pacific. And of course it was a film crew, shooting a western in 1924, that left behind the buffalo. The island became a kind of all-purpose backdrop for the American imagination, playing every faraway place at once, while sitting quietly off the coast of the city that was busy inventing the modern idea of faraway places, and it was all truly a gift. That is the part that keeps this from being merely a story about a clever rich man. Ordinary people, working families from Los Angeles who could never dream of owning a boat or a beach house, could get on one of Wrigley's steamships for the cost of a day out and cross to a private island and dance in the largest ballroom in the world and watch a first-run talkie and swim in clear water and look at buffalo. Which brings us to the buffalo, because no account of Catalina can avoid them, and they are the most Catalina thing that has ever happened. There are bison on Santa Catalina Island. American bison, buffalo, the great shaggy animals of the Great Plains, thousands of miles from anywhere they have ever belonged, living wild on a mountain in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Los Angeles. There are around 100 of them today. Tourists take tours specifically to see them. There is a cocktail named after them, and there is a quiet irony in which animals the island is now famous for. The creature that actually belonged there, the sea otter, was hunted out of the surrounding waters almost entirely, killed off for the fur trade in the decades before Wrigley, so that the animal native to that coast became a rarity, while the great symbol of the island became a plains animal that had never set foot in California until a film crew dumped it there by accident. The island lost its real wildlife and gained a fictional kind, and then fell in love with the fiction. It is, in miniature, the whole pattern of the place. The authentic thing removed, and a manufactured thing installed in its place, and beloved so thoroughly that hardly anyone remembers it was ever manufactured at all. And how they got there is a story that the island itself cannot fully agree on, which is the best thing about it. The standard version, the one you will hear on most of the tours, is that a Hollywood film crew brought a herd of bison to the island in 1924 to shoot a western, and when filming wrapped, it was too expensive to ship the animals back to the mainland, so they were simply left behind and they bred. And here we are. The part everyone agrees on is that a film crew brought them and left them. What no one can pin down is which film. The popular answer, repeated for decades, is a 1925 silent western called The Vanishing American, starring Richard Dix. It is a good story, and it has one significant problem, which is that if you actually watch The Vanishing American, there are no buffalo in it, and none of the landscape looks anything like Catalina. So a columnist for the island's own newspaper, the Catalina Islander, went digging, and back in a 1938 article, he attributed the herd instead to a different picture, a 1925 film called The Thundering Herd, which at least has the virtue of being about a buffalo hunt. And the accounts do not even agree on how many animals were left, giving numbers anywhere from 14 to 24. I love this, and I want to be honest that we cannot resolve it, because the uncertainty is the point. Here is an island whose most famous wild animals are a mistake, left behind by a movie no one can positively identify, and nobody minds because the buffalo have been there so long that they have become more real than the facts about them. They grew from that abandoned handful into a herd that at its peak numbered several hundred, as many as 400 or 600 by some counts, wandering the interior. Today the conservancy that manages the island keeps the number down around 100 or so, using birth control, and in the early 2000s it shipped surplus animals back to the mainland, to the Lakota Sioux at the Standing Rock and Rosebud reservations, who were working to restore bison on their own lands. There is something almost too neat in that last detail. Buffalo, brought to a California island as props by a film industry mythologizing the American West, and their descendants, a century later, sent back east to help native nations rebuild the actual herds that the actual West destroyed. The prop going home to become the real thing again. If you have come with me this far, out to a mountain in the sea and through the whole strange machine of it, you are the kind of person this channel is built for, and subscribing keeps the long ones coming. Because that last detail, the buffalo going home, points at something this cheerful story has been carefully walking around, and it is time to stop walking around it. The island Wrigley bought as a playground for all was not empty when the story of human beings on it began, and the people who were there first did not leave by choice. Long before it was anyone's premium, Catalina was a homeland. The people who lived there called the island Pimu, or Pimugna, and they called themselves the Pimugnians. They were part of the wider people that mainland Californians would later call the Tongva, and after Spanish missionization would call the Gabrielino, after the Mission San Gabriel. They had been on the island for thousands of years, long before the Egyptians built the pyramids, fishing the channel, trading with their relatives on the mainland near what is now San Pedro and Playa del Rey, and quarrying a beautiful blue-green stone called soapstone that they carved into bowls and traded up and down the coast. They were a maritime people, crossing that same channel Wrigley's steamships would later cross, in plank canoes, for trade and ceremony. Pimu was not a remote or empty rock. It was a known, inhabited, connected place, with villages and a language and a history of its own. The soapstone matters especially, because it made the island a centre of something larger than itself. Catalina has deposits of steatite, a soft blue-grey stone that can be carved with simple tools and that resist heat, which makes it ideal for cooking vessels. The Pimugnians quarried it and shaped it into bowls and ollas and effigies and beads, and traded these objects across an enormous network that reached deep into the mainland, hundreds of miles inland, so that a bowl carved on that island in the sea might end up in a village in the desert interior, passed hand to hand along trade routes older than any European map of the coast. In other words, long before William Wrigley made Catalina a destination that drew people across the channel, the island was already a destination that drew people across the channel for a stone instead of a ballroom, in canoes instead of steamships. The Pimugnians had built over thousands of years their own version of what Wrigley would build in a decade, an island whose value radiated outward to the mainland. It is worth sitting with that because it means the emptiness Wrigley thought he was developing was not the island's natural state. It was the recent violent result of that older world being destroyed. And then the missions came to the mainland, and everything the missions touched they emptied. Over the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Pimunyans were taken off their island. Some went to work at the missions, some to labour on the ranches that the Spanish and then Mexican land grants created. By the 1830s, the island's entire native population was gone, removed to a mainland that was itself being taken apart. The island Wrigley would later buy as unspoiled paradise had been cleared of its people a century before he ever saw it, and the emptiness that made it feel like a blank slate for a rich man's imagination was not natural. It was manufactured by removal. There are no known fluent speakers of the Pimunyan language left in the world. Descendants remain, and the Tongva persist as a people, and are working to recover what was taken, including their language, but the specific speech of that specific island, the words those canoe travellers used for that channel and that stone and those hills, is gone. And there is one more chapter here, and it is the ugliest thing in this entire story, and I am going to tell it plainly and then move on, because it deserves neither to be hidden nor to be dwelt on for entertainment. In the years right around when Wrigley was buying the island, roughly 1919 to 1922, a man named Ralph Glidden dug up the Pimunyan dead. Glidden called himself an archaeologist. He was not one. He was a grave robber with a shovel and a theatrical streak, and over a few years he excavated something on the order of 800 graves at some 100 sites across Catalina. And he took the human remains of the island's ancestral people, and he built them into a private roadside attraction, a so-called museum, that he decorated with the bones of the dead for paying visitors to gawk at. That happened on the same island, in the same years, that the rest of this story calls a paradise. The dance floor and the desecration were built at the same time. The remains Glidden and others took have been, in the decades since, the subject of long and painful efforts at return and reburial, and I am not going to describe any of it in detail because the people whose ancestors those are deserve better than to have it turned into a lurid aside in a video about chewing gum. But it belongs in the record, right next to the casino and the buffalo, because a story that gives you only the charm of Catalina is not telling you the truth about it. The paradise had owners before the Wrigleys, and the paradise had a cost, and the cost was paid by people who were removed and then, in death, disturbed. Hold both of those things, the wonder and the wrong, because the island contains both, and the best thing that was ever done with it, the thing this story is building toward, only means what it means if you are holding both. William Wrigley died in 1932, and the question of what would happen to an entire island held by one family passed to his son, and the answer that son eventually gave is the reason almost no one who visits Catalina today has any idea it was ever owned at all. William Wrigley died in January of 1932, at the age of 70 in Phoenix. He had in his last years built himself a memorial on the island he loved, high on a hill above Avalon made of Catalina stone quarried on the island, and roofed with Catalina tile from his own pottery, at the centre of a great botanical garden his wife Ada had dreamed up. He was laid to rest there, in the island, which was where he wanted to be. His remains were later moved to the mainland, to Forest Lawn in Glendale, over concerns about security, but the memorial still stands above the town, looking down over the harbour and the casino and the whole gift he had made, and the gift passed to his son. Philip Knight Wrigley, known as PK, was a different kind of man from his father. William was a salesman to his bones, a showman, a man who loved the noise and the crowd and the pitch. Philip was quieter, more private, more of an engineer in temperament, a man who fixed and maintained rather than promoted. He is one of the more unusual figures in the history of American business, precisely because he had so little of the hunger that usually defines it. He inherited one of the great fortunes and one of the most famous baseball teams in the country, and he seems to have regarded both mostly as responsibilities rather than prizes. He shunned publicity to a degree that frustrated the people around him. He turned the presidency of the gum company over to his own son in 1961, while keeping the parts he felt personally bound to. With the Cubs, this produced decades of loyal, patient, and mostly unsuccessful ownership. Philip kept the team, kept it in the family, kept Wrigley Field with its ivy and its daylight, and generally declined to do the ruthless things that might have won more. He was criticised for it endlessly. But it came from the same place as everything else about him, a sense that these things had been handed to him in trust, to be cared for, not exploited, and that temperament, unremarkable in a man running a ball club into another second division finish, becomes something quite different when the thing in trust is an entire island. Because a caretaker asks a different question than an owner does. An owner asks what he can get from a thing. A caretaker asks what the thing needs, and who it is really for and what happens to it after he's gone. William, the salesman, never fully asked those questions about Catalina. Philip, the caretaker, could hardly ask anything else. He inherited the gum company, and the Chicago Cubs, and the island, and for the rest of his life he tended all three, mostly out of a sense of duty to his father's vision rather than out of any hunger to make them bigger. And that difference in temperament turned out to matter enormously, because it fell to the quiet, dutiful son, not the showman father, to decide what an island is actually for. Philip took over the island and did something that, on paper, looks like simple continuity, but was actually a slow and significant change of purpose. He kept it going. He maintained his father's improvements and added his own. In the 1930s, he founded a small airline, the Wilmington Catalina Airline, to fly people from the Los Angeles harbor out to the island, extending his father's obsession with access. He brought in a pair of designers, Otis and Dorothy Shepard, who had done advertising work for the Wrigley Company, and had them give Avalon a coherent look, a soft, early California Spanish Mediterranean style. All tile and wrought iron and bell towers and fountains and olive trees. If you walk Avalon today and feel that it has a distinct, deliberate charm, that it looks like an idea of a place rather than an accident of one, that is the Shepherds, working for Philip, refining his father's premium into something even more polished. The Shepherds were not landscape architects or town planners by training. They were advertising designers. Otis Shepard had done some of the most striking commercial art of the era, including the clean, modern look of Wrigley's own gum advertising, and, later, elements of the visual identity of Wrigley Field itself. And Philip Wrigley turned that same skill, the skill of building a coherent, appealing image, loose on an entire town. They chose a palette and a style and applied it everywhere. The soft Spanish Mediterranean look, the tile, the wrought iron, the fountains, the bell towers, the olive and palm trees, a serpentine wall winding through the town, soft lighting in the evenings, even, for a time, wandering musicians serenading the visitors. They were, in effect, art directing a place, treating a real town full of real people as a composition to be perfected, the way you would perfect a magazine advertisement. And it worked, in the sense that the result is truly lovely and has drawn people for a century. But it is worth noticing what it means, because it is the deepest version of the whole Catalina idea. The island's charm is not accidental, and it is not exactly natural. It was designed, deliberately, by professional persuaders to produce a specific feeling in a visitor's chest. The enchantment you feel stepping off the boat is, at least in part, a manufactured effect, engineered by the same minds that engineered a nation's affection for a stick of gum. Which does not make it less real as an experience. It just means that even the island's beauty is, in the end, a kind of advertisement, one so well made that it stopped looking like one. Then came the war and the island's strange interlude as something other than a playground. During the Second World War, Catalina was effectively closed to tourists and handed over to the military. Its isolation, which had made it perfect for leisure, now made it perfect for training. The armed forces used the island as a training facility, and the steamships that had carried vacationers carried soldiers, and for a few years the Great Gift sat quiet, its ballroom dark, its harbour full of a different kind of traffic. Different branches used different parts of the island. The Coast Guard, the Army, the Maritime Service, the Navy, all found uses for a large, isolated, controllable piece of land close to a major port. Merchant mariners trained there. Signal operations ran from the heights. A place built entirely around welcoming the public was, for the duration, closed to it and turned to war, its geography of pleasure repurposed into a geography of preparation. There is something quietly telling in how easily that conversion happened, and it goes back to the fragility we will come to, because the island could be closed completely, overnight, handed to the military and emptied of the public precisely because it was owned. One decision did it. The playground for all became a base, and the all were simply not invited for a few years, and there was no one they could appeal to because the whole thing had always run on the will of an owner, The war just made visible a truth that had been there the whole time. The Cubs stopped coming. The dance floor waited. After the war, the tourists came back and the Cubs came back, though not for long. In 1951, the Chicago Cubs held their spring training on Catalina for the last time, ending a 30-year tradition. The dateline that had carried the island's name into the national papers every winter went away. The island was still there, still beautiful, still owned by the Wrigleys, but the great promotional machine of the 1920s was winding down and the world was changing around it. Air travel was making far-flung places accessible. Los Angeles was exploding outward. A day trip to Catalina was no longer the most glamorous thing a family could imagine, and Philip Wrigley, tending the island his father had loved, seems to have started asking a question that his father, the salesman, may never have fully faced. What is this actually for? And who is it actually for? Because the uncomfortable thing sitting underneath William Wrigley's whole beautiful gift, and Philip was thoughtful enough to see it. The island was a playground for all, William had said, a gift to the public, and in one real sense it was. Anyone could buy a ticket on the steamer and come. But it was not the public's. It was his. Every acre of it, every building, every rule belonged to one family. The public was invited warmly, generously, at low prices, but they were guests, and a guest can be uninvited. A gift that the giver still owns is not really a gift. It is a loan, or a favour, or an advertisement, and it lasts exactly as long as the owner wishes it to last, and not one day longer. William Wrigley had built a paradise open to all, and kept the deed to all of it in his own safe, and an island held that way is fragile in a specific and permanent way. It is only ever one decision away from becoming something else. One heir who needs cash, one family that loses interest, one buyer with a different vision, and the playground for all becomes a private estate, or a resort for the rich, or a subdivision of vacation homes for people who can afford a mountain in the sea. The whole thing depended forever on the goodwill of whoever happened to own it, and goodwill is not a legal structure. Goodwill dies with people. It is worth being fair to William here, because the tension in his gift was not hypocrisy. He sincerely wanted ordinary people to have the island, and he truly gave them extraordinary access to it at prices they could afford. The playground for all was not a lie. It was real, and millions of people lived it. But there is a difference between generosity and a gift, and it is not a small one. And it is the difference the whole ending of this story turns on. Generosity is something an owner does. It flows from the owner's will, and it depends on the owner's continued goodwill, and it can be withdrawn the moment the will changes, and it dies when the owner dies, or when the heirs decide differently, or when a tax bill forces their hand. Generosity is a faucet, and someone always has a hand on the valve. A gift, a true and complete gift, is different in kind. It severs the thing from the giver entirely. Once given, it no longer depends on anyone's mood or survival or solvency. It is simply gone from the giver's hands and into the world permanently, and no change of heart can call it back. William Wrigley was generous with Catalina for the whole of his life, but he never gave it. He held the valve until the day he died, and then he passed the valve to his son, and the island remained as fragile as it had always been, one decision away from becoming something else. Philip Wrigley understood that the only way to actually give something away is to stop owning it. And there was a hard, practical reason this was on his mind, beyond any philosophy, because the tax code was about to teach the family the same lesson whether they liked it or not. Great American fortunes face a specific problem at the moment they pass from one generation to the next. The government levies an estate tax, an inheritance tax, on large fortunes when the owner dies, and it can take an enormous bite. For most wealth, this is an inconvenience. For wealth that is tied up in a single, huge, hard-to-sell asset, like an entire island, it is a trap. When the owner dies, the heirs owe tax on the value of the island, in cash, whether or not the island produces any cash, and if they cannot pay, they may be forced to sell the very thing they are trying to keep, simply to satisfy the bill. An island held privately, in other words, is not just fragile because an owner might change his mind. It is fragile because death itself, and the tax that follows death, keeps threatening to break it up, generation after generation, forever. Every heir inherits both the island and a tax problem large enough to destroy it. There is one clean way out of that trap, and it is the same move that solves the philosophical problem at the same time. You give the asset to a charitable trust. A gift to a recognized charity is removed from your taxable estate. It is no longer yours to be taxed on, and once inside the trust, It is protected in perpetuity, beyond the reach of any future death, any future tax, any future heir's bad judgment or bad luck. So the deepest thing Philip Wrigley did was to notice that the only way to save the island from the tax collector was identical to the only way to truly give it to the public. Both required the same act. Stop owning it. Put it somewhere no one owns it. The moral answer and the practical answer were the same answer, and he took it. Not to open it, not to share it, not to run it generously for the public while holding the deed, to actually let go of it, permanently, in a form that no future Wrigley and no one else could ever undo. So in 1972, Philip Knight Wrigley created the Santa Catalina Island Conservancy. It was set up as a private charitable foundation, an organisation whose entire legal purpose was to hold and protect the island in its natural state, forever, for conservation and education and public access. And it was not the family. That was the whole point. It was a separate legal entity designed to outlive the Wrigleys, with a mission written into its bones that no owner's mood could override. And then, on the 15th of February 1975, the Wrigleys and the Offields did the thing that this entire story has been travelling toward. They deeded the island away. Roughly 42,000 acres, the interior and the coastline, the wild heart of Catalina, went to the Conservancy. The figure is usually given as about 88% of the island, though some sources say 90. Whichever number you take, it is nearly all of it. The Santa Catalina Island Company, the Wrigley business, kept a small remaining share around 11%, mostly in and around the town of Avalon. About 1% is otherwise privately held, and the vast majority, the mountains and the canyons and the beaches and the Buffalo Range, passed out of private ownership entirely, into a trust that could never sell it, never subdivide it, never turn it into a rich man's estate. That is the oldest and largest private land trust in Southern California, and it is why, today, you can go to Catalina and hike for miles across open, undeveloped land and see the buffalo, and stand on a wild coastline an hour from one of the largest cities on Earth, and it will still be there for your grandchildren, because it does not belong to anyone who can take it away. And the Conservancy has turned out to be more than a legal device for locking the land away. It has become an active steward of one of the more ecologically remarkable places in California. Catalina, cut off from the mainland for thousands of years, evolved its own creatures, found nowhere else on Earth. The most famous is the island fox, a fox the size of a house cat, a miniature version of its mainland cousin, shrunk by the peculiar pressures of island life. In the late 1990s, that fox nearly went extinct, its population collapsing after a disease, canine distemper, reached the island, most likely carried by a stowaway raccoon, and swept through animals that had no immunity to it. The population crashed to a few dozen. The Conservancy mounted a captive breeding and vaccination program, and over the following years brought the island fox back from the edge, one of the genuine conservation success stories of the era. The Conservancy also does the quieter, harder work that owning most of an island entails. It manages the invasive plants that centuries of ranching and gardening introduced. It manages the buffalo, keeping the herd healthy and its numbers controlled with contraception rather than slaughter. It runs education programs and trails and campsites, so the public access that the gift was meant to guarantee is real and not just theoretical. In other words, the gift did not just preserve a view. It created an institution whose entire reason to exist is to keep the island alive and open in perpetuity, answerable to a mission rather than to an owner. That is the difference between a generous owner and a completed gift, made concrete. A generous owner protects the island as long as he chooses to. A trust protects it because protecting it is the only thing it is legally allowed to do. The family gave away the premium, for real this time, permanently, to everyone. It was not, to be precise, absolutely everything, and honesty requires the qualification. The family business, the Santa Catalina Island Company, kept its roughly 11%, concentrated in and around Avalon, the developed town where the hotels and the harbour and the commercial life are. That portion remained a business, and it still is one today, running much of the tourism on the island. So the picture is not one of pure total renunciation. The Wrigley interests kept the part that makes money and gave away the part that does not. The wild interior and the coastline, the part that is expensive to hold and impossible to profit from and irreplaceable if lost. But notice that this only sharpens the point rather than blunting it. They kept the product, the town, the business, the thing that pays, and they gave away the premium, the wild land, the beauty, the thing that does not pay and never could, which is the pattern of William Wrigley's entire life stated one final time, except that this time the giving was real and permanent. The product stayed a product, the premium became a gift, and the gift is the part that will still be there, unchanged, when the hotels have been rebuilt 10 times over, and the current company is a distant memory. And now look at what that means against the whole life of William Wrigley, because his son completed the pattern the father had spent his life almost, but not quite seeing all the way through. William's genius was the premium. 3 times he discovered that the thing you give away is worth more than the thing you sell, and 3 times he had the nerve to give up the product and sell the gift. But he never took the final step. He kept giving things away as a way of selling something else. The gum sold the name, the island sold the name. The gift was always, in the end, a tool. He was still, always, holding the deed. Philip took the last step his father never took. He gave the premium away with nothing attached, not to sell anything, not to promote anything, not as a loan the family could call back. He simply let it go, into a form where it would belong to everyone and no one forever. And the detail that proves the whole thing, the detail that a novelist would be told was too on the nose to use, the family kept the island by giving it away. And they lost the thing they tried to keep. When Philip Wrigley died in April of 1977, just months after his wife Helen, the family was hit with enormous inheritance taxes, the tax the government levies on great fortunes when they pass between generations. And to pay that tax bill, the Wrigley family had to sell something. They had to liquidate a major asset to satisfy the government. They did not sell the island. They could not. They had already given it away, put it beyond the reach of any tax collector or heir or creditor, locked it into a trust that no death and no tax bill could touch. What they sold in 1981 to pay the taxes was the Chicago Cubs, the ball club, the beloved team, the thing William Wrigley had bought and cherished and moved to the island every spring for 30 years. The thing the family had owned for 60 years was sold off to satisfy a tax bill because it was still property, and property can be taken. The island survived. The team did not, and the only difference between them, the only reason one endured in the family's intention forever and the other was sold within a decade, is that one had been truly given away and the other had been kept. That is the final proof of William Wrigley's own life lesson, delivered by his son, and it is almost unbearably exact. The thing they held on to, they lost. The thing they let go of, they kept forever, in the only way anything is ever really kept, which is by making it belong to everyone. And so we arrive, finally, back at the building on the water, and at the strange fact we started with. The casino at Avalon still stands, round and white and glowing, the first thing you see and the last thing you see, and it still has never held a game of chance. It still has the largest circular ballroom in the world, and the theatre where the talkies played, and it is still, at heart, a premium. A thing that looks like it will take from you, and only ever gives. Almost no one who photographs it knows any of this. Walk Avalon today and it feels, more than almost any American place, like it simply is. Like it grew there naturally, a perfect small Mediterranean town on a perfect small bay. Golf carts hum along the narrow streets, because cars are strictly limited on the island, with a waiting list for a permit that runs for years, one of the many quiet ways the island's ownership still shapes daily life beneath the surface. The tile is everywhere, on fountains and stair risers and storefronts, the bright Catalina pottery pattern that came from a stuck car in the mud. The casino sits on its point, the buffalo graze in the interior. It is, by common agreement, one of the loveliest places in California, and the ownership, the whole vast fact of it, has become nearly invisible. Most visitors could not tell you the name Wrigley. They do not think about who owns the land they are hiking, or why the interior is so undeveloped, when the mainland an hour away is one continuous city, or why the town stops so cleanly at its edges and gives way to open wild country. They experience the results of a century of deliberate control and a final decisive gift, and they experience it as nature, as simply the way the island is. And maybe that is the most American thing about the whole story. This island where a fortune built on manufactured desire was spent manufacturing a paradise, which was then given away so completely that it came to feel like it had never been made at all. It sits there off the coast of Los Angeles, The city that invented the modern business of selling feelings, an hour from the studios that taught the world to fall in love with places that do not exist. And Catalina is the physical version of that same trick. A real place made to feel like a dream, sold like a product, and finally handed to the public with the price tag torn off, so that what remains is just the dream, floating in the sea, apparently free. A visitor stands on the wild coast and feels that they have found something untouched and eternal. Almost everything about that feeling was arranged. And yet the coast really is wild now, and really is protected forever, and really does belong to them in the only sense that matters. The manufactured thing became, in the end, truly real, which is the strangest and most hopeful turn in the entire story, which is again, the gift working perfectly. A favour announces itself, a monument demands you look at it, but a completed gift disappears into the ordinary texture of the world, until the people enjoying it cannot imagine it having been any other way, and stop seeing the giver entirely. The invisibility is not the story being forgotten. The invisibility is the story's happy ending. They do not know that the whole island was once one man's private property, bought sight unseen because a picture looked good. They do not know that a single family held 22 miles of California for more than half a century, longer than most family businesses of any kind survive at all. They do not know that for 30 years the sports pages of America carried the island's name every winter, because the man who owned it also owned a baseball team and could not see any reason to keep his loves apart. They do not know that the buffalo on the hills are the leftover cast of a movie no one can identify. They do not know that the charming tile underfoot came from clay a car got stuck in. They do not know that the Chicago Cubs once trained where the golf course is now, or that a future president once called their games from the island, or that the whole place was run for 30 years as the world's most elaborate advertisement for a stick of gum. And above all, they do not know that it was given away, that the reason they are allowed to be here at all, hiking the wild interior, standing on the empty coast, is that a quiet man decided in the 1970s that the only way to truly love a place is to stop owning it. The visitors experience Catalina as simply a place, a beautiful public place that has always been there and always will be, which is precisely the feeling that only a completed gift can produce. A place you are a guest in feels borrowed. A place that belongs to everyone feels like it is yours. That is the difference between what William built and what Philip finished. William built a paradise you could visit. Philip built a paradise you could belong to. And the second one required giving up the thing the first one was built to protect, which is ownership. There's one more way to see the whole shape of it, and it goes back to the gum. William Wrigley spent his life learning 3 times over that the free gift is worth more than the product. It made him one of the richest men in America, but he only ever understood it as a technique, a way to sell. The gift was bait. The gift was strategy. Behind every free thing he handed out, there was a product he was actually selling, and a deed he was actually holding. His son understood the deeper version, that a gift held is not a gift, that the value of the free thing is not that it draws people to something you own, but that given away completely, it becomes something no one owns and everyone shares, and that this, and not the selling, is the highest use of the thing. There is a symmetry in it so complete it feels designed, though no one designed it. William Wrigley made his money by understanding in the small that a free gift outperforms the product it is attached to. Philip Wrigley preserved the family's greatest possession by understanding, in the large, that a gift only becomes permanent when you stop attaching it to anything at all, including yourself. The father used the gift to sell. The son used the gift to release. And the son's version is the one that lasted because a thing given to sell something is still secretly owned. And anything owned can be lost, but a thing given away completely is beyond loss because there is nothing left to take. An island given away outlived a fortune. A ballroom that never took a bet outlasted the empire that built it. A herd of buffalo abandoned by a film crew became beloved. And a family that gave away a mountain in the sea got to keep it forever, precisely because they no longer owned it. Almost nobody who visits Catalina knows it was ever owned. That is not a failure of memory. That is the monument working as intended. The highest thing you can build, it turns out, is a gift so complete that the people enjoying it forget it was ever given, because they experience it not as a favour from an owner, but simply as the world, open and free, and theirs. Think for a moment about all the other ways the very rich try to make themselves permanent, because it throws what the Wrigleys did into relief. They put their names on buildings, and the buildings are renamed when the next owner comes along. They endow foundations that drift from their intentions within a generation or two. They build monuments and mausoleums, and the monuments weather and the visitors stop coming, and the name on the marble means nothing to the people walking past it. William Wrigley himself did some of this. He built a memorial to himself on the island, and then even his own remains were moved off it, to the mainland, for security. The literal monument to the man did not even hold his body. The most durable thing the family ever made was the thing they stopped putting their name on. The island does not say Wrigley. The Conservancy is not called the Wrigley Trust. The land is not a monument to a family. It is simply open and wild and there, and it will outlast every building with the name carved on it, precisely because it asks nothing of memory. You do not have to remember the giver to benefit from the gift. In fact, forgetting the giver is a sign the gift is complete. The chewing gum man spent a fortune trying to attach his name to the greatest gift he could imagine, and the final proof of how good the gift was is that his name has quietly fallen away from it, and the island remains belonging to no one, which is to say, to everyone, which is the only way anything is ever really kept. If you want the story of another great American fortune that ran headfirst into the question of what a rich family owes the public, there is a companion piece worth telling next, about a very different heir who tried to hold on to everything and what it cost him.